Welcome to One Voice Evolving, Season 3, Resilience Reimagined. This week, our guest is Hilary Giovale, is a mother, writer, community organizer, and ninth-generation American settler who lives in Flagstaff, Arizona. As an active reparationist, she seeks to follow Indigenous and Black leadership in support of human rights, environmental justice, and equitable futures. She is the author of Becoming a Good Relative, calling white settlers toward truth, healing, and repair. She has a fascinating journey and a lot of insight to give us about somatic work and generational trauma and healing. Please welcome Hilary today. So, Hilary, welcome.
Thank you, Kim. I'm so happy to be with you today.
I'm happy to be with you too. And I love your artwork in the background. I'm so fascinated by the diversity of your experience and your story. Can you
Mm,
just tell our listeners who are women over 40 who are inclined to advance racial equity in our lifetime, the biggest sticking point they have is they're afraid of doing it wrong, or they're
mm,
afraid of offending someone, or they're just afraid of sticking their neck out. And really, in this political cycle, there are a lot of people who are kind of paralyzed
right.
between, do I speak up or do I play safe?
Oh man. Yes, I
Yeah,
hear you. I know. It is such a surreal time for
yeah.
those of us, especially I feel like those of us who are white, who were brought up with these concepts of like this is the greatest nation on earth and American exceptionalism and meritocracy and all of these types of concepts. It's a very alarming time to see the veil pulled back on what is actually underneath all of this. And so I'm just kind of watching day by day with what unfolds, and it's really interesting to me because when I'm around progressive white community,
Mhm.
it's very easy for us to be completely shocked and outraged by what's going on.
Right.
And then when I'm around indigenous community, it's a completely different reaction. It's like, oh, yeah, this is another situation that we've dealt with before. We've dealt with these kind of people before, and we're just going to keep going.
Yep.
And
Yep.
and also too with Black friends, I've heard the same thing. It's like, well, we just keep rolling. We know how to survive these things, and we're not that threatened, and we're not that worried about this.
Right. Right.
And so
Mhm.
that has been a big eye opener for me in this political landscape because I find myself being shocked all the time. Um, but then, but then also, I think that shock is also a function of the privilege that I have.
Right. Yep. I
Mhm.
call that my white bubble.
Right.
And it is the place I can go hide anytime I want, which is why I do this podcast every week to keep me in the game
Oh,
and
I love that.
not going back to my comfort zone. This is my accountability to myself.
I love that. That
Yeah.
is so beautiful. I mean, I think everybody has the capacity to do something like what you're doing, where we are like building in systems of accountability, building in ways of being in conversation, in dialogue, building in re-education for ourselves, all the things.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really beautiful that you've taken that on.
And community. We are in season
Mhm.
3, which just makes me laugh. We're in the top 1% of podcasts just by virtue of the fact that we've been consistent for over a year.
Yeah.
And the caliber of guests, you are an exceptional guest. The caliber of guests has been up leveled every season as
Oh,
the as the as the mission becomes more refined.
right.
It's
Oh,
fascinating to
excellent.
me. Yeah. So tell us about where you live and what brought you to this place.
Yeah. Well, I live on Hopi, Havasupai, Apache, Pueblo, Dene land, among other tribes. And let's see, I recently reorganized my office, so now the mountain is sitting over my right shoulder
Uh-huh.
to the north,
Okay.
and I live right at the foot of a sacred mountain of kinship. And this mountain has been revered by all the indigenous nations of this region forever.
Okay.
And the way it's been explained to me, she is a female mountain. She's a being of kinship.
Mhm.
She's a being of love and community and relationship.
Mhm.
And I have lived here for over 30 years. I moved here in the early 90s to go to college. And, you know, when I first moved here, I had no idea about this being a sacred mountain or even about the concept of sacred landscape at all. But I've had friends tell me since then that this mountain is so powerful, she works on the people who live nearby, whether we're aware of her or not.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
And so that's I really feel like everything I can offer and share, it ties back to her
Uh-huh.
because I've been sitting at her feet and sleeping at her feet and eating at her feet for over 30 years.
Right. Right. And so 30 years, and what have you done for a profession there?
Well, I have for a long time I was a dance teacher.
Okay.
And I directed performing troops here, and I was part of performing troops elsewhere as well. Um, let's see, I have primarily been a mom, a parent, and running the household here, and I am also a reparative philanthropist. And then in the more recent years, over the last 5 years or so, I have been teaching and facilitating groups around the content that is in my book, which is called Becoming a Good Relative. And so I have been facilitating a lot of groups on Zoom, a few in person as well, to work through that material about settler colonialism and whiteness and reparations and things like that.
So I think I would like to learn more from you. I said I want to just sit at your feet. I would like to learn more about reparations because as I've worked with white women and my role is to take my leadership voice and teach other women how to lead in this space, not to be an ally, not to be an advocate, not to be, I'm not putting somebody else out there to get hurt. How do I lead in this space with my influence, my privilege, and my power? What do I do to make
Yeah.
sense?
Well, it's interesting. I just came out of a class that I was facilitating just before this interview. And in that class, we brought in an elder to work with us. And she did a ritual with us that was about banishing grief, guilt, shame, and anger. And this was a group of white people, primarily identifying as women, and it's also a group that's focused ultimately on reparative giving and reparations in general. And it's kind of like you can't do one without the other because I've heard it told in different circles that the number one response that white Americans have when they are presented with the word reparations is one of blockage, fear, guilt, shame, and resistance, denial. Like all of these things are what tend to come up for us. We often tend to argue with the premise and say, oh well, it's too big of a problem, we can never fix it, so why bother even beginning to try.
Right.
All of these are the responses that come up, but the truth is reparations are accessible to each and every one of us on a personal level,
Mhm.
and we have to move through our guilt and shame and resistance
Mhm.
before, or I would say actually in tandem with beginning reparations. Because for me, reparations are not effective if they come from a place of shame. If they
Mhm.
come out of a sense of obligation and guilt and, oh, I'm a bad person and I'm being punished,
Mhm.
then they will not have the desired effect.
Right.
And so it's really actually very deep spiritual work that we have to do.
Mhm.
to work through all those blockages and all of those stories inside of ourselves in order to come out the other side and make reparations that are really clean.
So I used to do some legacy work with clients that help them in this stage of life. You know, what's the story of your life that you want to leave for your great grandchildren to see, or whatever that is. And I realized after a while, the only story that matters is the one you tell yourself.
Hmm.
The only story that matters in reparations is the one you tell yourself. So when we say reparations and I get the pushback of, well, I wasn't a slave owner or that was then or whatever that is,
Right,
it's like, what is your internal dialogue that's causing that reaction? Because it wasn't my word reparations that triggered that in you.
right,
And there is, just like I know, I see in working with diverse populations in corporate America, that there is generational and regional trauma that is steeped into their psyche. They're, I mean, it born with it. Well, we were all raised in this racist society. And until I figured out what racism cost me, I was just as colorblind as
right,
I was taught to be. So, so how do we begin to access what lies are we telling ourselves?
right. Well, you raise a really good point. What has racism cost us?
Yes.
And for me, I think that racism has cost me my integrity and the full expression of my capacity as a human being.
Yeah.
Because, whiteness, I feel like I'm turning 50 this year. Right when I turned 40, this process began that completely rewired my whole understanding of reality. But the first 40 years of my life, it was like I was living with this lid covering my head, like dimming my light and keeping me playing small and keeping me caught in my stories, right? And the story I was telling myself was, oh, well, my people were recent immigrants. They came from Northern Ireland. This is on my mom's side. They came over to Canada in the late 1800s, and so therefore this whole project of colonialism and slavery and all of these horrific things have nothing to do with me.
Yeah.
That was the story that I made up that I believed in my mind. And so I know for a fact if someone had presented me with an option of making reparations while that story was at play, I would have put all of my resistance at work to block that suggestion.
Yes.
And for me, it was realizing that actually that branch of the family that were recent immigrants was only one branch. There were three others who were here much earlier in the 16 and 1700s, and they were right there at the beginning with land grants and enslaving people and etc. And so um, changing my own personal story
Yeah.
and doing the spiritual work that it took to change that story is what has opened up a greater capacity
Mhm.
to begin this process of reparations and truth telling and so forth.
So I work with inclined white women because I don't have the energy anymore to break denial
Right.
for them or with them. So they already have to have something already start to crack open in order for me to spend the energy to work with them. How do you determine in your work when somebody is ready to ask the harder questions about their story, and how
Yeah.
do you navigate that?
One of the ways I have been co-facilitating groups for 5 years, and over the 5 years, we've made our application process much more clear and put better filters on it.
Huh?
And one of the questions that we ask is, are you a person who benefits from white privilege?
Wow.
You know?
Yeah.
Because if they can't see that they do,
Yeah.
then they're not ready to work with us, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Another filter we've put on more recently is, are you willing to commit to a process of making personal reparations?
Mm-hmm.
So we need to know that they are willing to commit to that process right out of the gate before we even begin. And we go through a 8 or 9 month process with them to
Yeah.
work through that.
I love that. And I'm a direct person, and that's probably why I like that, because so often that's how you get allies who flake out when it gets hard because
Mhm.
they didn't think it through.
Right,
They weren't committed. They were committed to this cause in this moment, but flavor of the day kind
right.
of thing. And and they can have come a long way in facilitating groups or book clubs or whatever they want to do. But when it comes down to the real conversation about reparation for harms done,
Right.
it's inconvenient truth.
That's right. Yeah. And we find that even, I mean, this it has taught me so much about the social conditioning of whiteness because we find that even when people answer those questions up front, by the time we get to the part of our process where we begin making reparations plans, we start seeing them, they're not showing up anymore to
Yeah.
class. Some of them,
Yeah.
they're showing up and they're saying, I didn't do the homework and I don't know why,
Yeah.
and there's
Mhm.
a lot of resistance that is part of our white culture that
Mhm.
enables us to bypass, but it also, the thing I see the most is that it creates this very self-defeating talk in our own minds
Mhm.
where we tell ourselves, well, I'm not smart enough to do this. I'm not good enough to do this. I don't have enough resources to do this. I don't have enough time, whatever it is. And all of that is a lot of what we do is simply just hold people's hands as they walk through those stories
Mhm.
and help them see that they're not true,
Right.
you know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. How long does, is there an average? How long does that take?
The entire process, just the reparation.
The hand holding through the resistance they didn't know they had.
Well, we've had some people who have been able to get through that within, a few weeks
Mm-hmm.
or a couple months. And then we've had others where, it's been years
Mm-hmm.
where the system of excuses is still
Uh-huh.
intact, and then we have to push a little harder, and it's been beautiful too because we've seen, my co-facilitator and I have seen that when we've pushed back on some of that resistance, at
Mhm.
first it's seen as being a little bit harsh or mean because we're not supposed to do that to each other as white ladies.
Right.
We're supposed
Yeah.
to enable each other.
Yeah.
That's
Yes.
our conditioning, yeah. And
Mhm.
so it can be construed as being a little bit too
Mhm.
much,
Mhm.
but then we've had people go through incredible breakthroughs with
Mhm.
that little bit of extra pressure. And we've
Uh-huh.
seen we've seen people come out the other side and say, I'm so glad that you pushed me. I'm so glad that you held my feet over the fire. And I'm
Mhm.
so glad that you wouldn't let me off the hook.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
And that is, so as I've worked with Black creators, that is the part when they stepped back after this election cycle and said, we're not, no, we're gonna find our joy and take a rest, and y'all need to figure yourselves out over there. You don't
Right,
you don't know
right.
how to be in community. You don't know, you need to do that. And one of the pieces of that puzzle is being able to be in crucial and uncomfortable conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And why do you suppose it is? And you've got a lot more experience in diversity in diverse communities than I do. Is it that we have been in this bubble of protection with our patriarchy and our unearned privilege? that we haven't had to suffer the consequences that we are all now going to suffer together. Uh,
Right.
and so we haven't built that resilience, and that perhaps on the other side of whatever this is going to be, that resilience reimagined is going to be the ability to call each other out or in, whichever way you want to phrase it, without that incredible, I've never had to be this uncomfortable just to get a goal before.
Right.
Right?
That's true. That's a muscle that we haven't really had to build or exercise very much.
Right.
We've been insulated from a lot of realities.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I think the flip side of it too, I mean, that's kind of one way of looking at privilege, that it's a form of insulation. But then the flip side too is that it's actually hurting us in the long run, that
Mm-hmm.
we don't have those skills.
Right.
We don't have that resilience.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not serving us.
No, no. If I haven't learned anything else in this last year, it is that silence does not keep you safe. So that playing small, that go along to get along.
Hmm.
Nope,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah. We've got to grow past that.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And so some of it is deprogramming, some of
Hmm.
it's deconditioning, deconstructing.
Yeah.
You've got your fingers in every part of that puzzle. So for someone who, white woman over 40, has now some time, some resources, and some energy to re-examine the story of her life, where do you begin with them? You
Mm.
begin with historical things, the systemic things, or you do begin with their personal experience? Where do you start?
You know, there are several different entry points, and I think they're all good. So I'm gonna share a couple, but then I would encourage people to go with whatever resonates,
Mhm.
because there has to be resonance to get into this. This work is so hard. There's so much that wants to pull us away from it. And so we've got to start at a place that feels easy to slip into. So one is, for example, reading a book.
Mhm.
I always recommend Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book,
Mhm.
An Indigenous People's History of the United States. That's
Okay.
one book I always recommend, simply because so many of us have not been taught an accurate history of the United States at all. And
Right.
what we've been taught is completely false in some ways, and in other ways, it's completely, taken out of context and spun.
Mhm.
Um, and so that's one way to get started. Another way to get started is to sit with your friends or your family and begin telling stories with each other
Mhm.
about your ancestors, about why did they come here? What were the circumstances? Again, maybe reading a book about the historical conditions in the places where they immigrated from, and learning what was the context for their immigration.
Mhm.
Another possible entry point, and this was mine,
Uh-huh.
was creating an ancestor altar in your home.
Okay.
And I had no idea what I was getting into. But I created an ancestor altar. I began putting offerings down for my ancestors and asking to understand who they were, what they were about. I had a feeling that they were trying to communicate with me. So I was asking, what do you want me to know?
Mhm.
And that action right there opened up a whole world of experiences and relationships and people and, encounters that really changed my life and enabled this whole path to unfold for me.
Mhm.
So those are just three ways, but I think any of them work. The main thing is that you have to feel a sense of connection with the path that you choose
Yeah.
to compel you.
Mhm. Right. Well, first order change. It has to be not just a head thing. It's got to be that emotion has to be strong to hold the connection and make it sustainable.
That's right. That's right. And that's the thing too about the books. Like, reading books, history books is a great way to start, but we can't let it stop with, where it just gets stuck in the mental echo chamber of judgment and going, oh my God, that's horrible. I would never do that. What were these people thinking? And then put it back on the shelf. It's like we've got to let ourselves feel it,
Mhm.
and I remember it took me years to get through that book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, because I kept crying
Yeah.
and I kept falling apart and I kept just having to lie down on the ground and wail because it was so shocking and upsetting to realize what has actually happened here.
Right. Well, and shocking and upsetting. Shocking and upsetting to know that nobody ever told us that.
Right.
Why the hell? I have a master's degree. Why did I never learn this piece of history? How did I not know about Juneteenth?
Right.
Simple things, right?
Yes.
And then all of a sudden, once you see a slice of that, then you apply it to the current day and you can't unsee it.
That's right.
It's like, oh, now I know how it happened because it's happening again.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And also I can add too what you're saying about once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
This is something that makes it very uncomfortable to be in white friendships and white community for a while. It can make it very uncomfortable because if you're the only one in your circle who has seen it and no one else is seeing it and maybe actually choosing actively not to see it,
Yeah.
then you will suddenly feel very isolated,
Mhm.
you know? But also, this is part of the work I do now is like letting people know you're not alone. I mean, we may be able to come together across a whole bunch of different states and Canada and Europe, and I've even had people in South America, etc. We may need to come together virtually across far spread distances,
Uh-huh.
but we do need each other. We need community that's aware, that we can support each other in the seeing of
Mhm.
it and the cognitive dissonance that creates.
Right. Right. I know that after the election, it was the first time in my life that I walked out of my door in my little white neighborhood and looked at other white women skeptically. First
Mm,
time in my life that I said, I don't know which one of the 42% you were.
right,
And I am not willing to risk my family's future and well-being on that. I learned in short order. So I felt very isolated. It was like just a sliver of what people of color feel. Just enough of awareness to go, oh my God, this is awful. And then to say, it doesn't take very long talking to somebody though, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth, right? It
right,
doesn't take very long to figure out if they are inclined or not inclined,
right,
or if
right,
they're even conscious or care to be conscious of the things coming out of their mouth.
right. That's true. That's
And
true.
so then for me, it becomes a boundary issue
Hmm.
because I used to work with highly functioning addicts and alcoholics for 30 years. And so I know about denial and breaking denial and the hard work and the families. And I'm not dealing people's denial anymore. So if I meet somebody in denial, I'm really you are allowed to stay there as long as you want. And I am not going to be the person who's going to try and shine a light for that.
Yeah,
There's too many people who are ready. And if I busy myself trying to fix somebody who doesn't want to be fixed, that is not the best use of anybody's energy,
right. That's the same conclusion I've come to as well.
is it?
Oh yeah, I'm putting my energy into the ones who are ready
Yes.
because we need each other. We need support. Hmm.
Mhm. Yeah. And
Yeah.
that finding community, these podcast interviews are awesome for me because I've got this great network now of like-minded women from everywhere. but that I never would have had the opportunity to know in my real life, in my real world.
Oh, that's so awesome.
Yeah, it is.
Yes.
So tell me about your book writing process. When was it published?
It was published in October of 24,
Okay.
and I was so glad it came out then. And not this year, but I was glad it came out then so it could kind of get some legs before the current situation that we're seeing.
Mhm,
Um, and so yeah, it before that it was really about a 9-year process
mhm,
of, several things happening that began instigating curiosity, and then the process of writing was at least 8 years. And I'm not really a writer, I never thought of myself writing a book. I never had that as a goal or a desire in life, but for some reason, this assignment showed up. And I first received news of this assignment from a Dilogun reading, which is from the Ifa Orisha tradition of West Africa
mhm,
by a wonderful elder named Yeye Tish.
mhm.
And before I had even, you know, typed the first words, she said, your ancestors are telling me about a book that you wrote. And I said, I haven't written a book. And she said, well, they're telling me that the book is already written and you need to get out of the way.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. And
Huh?
she's an author. She's written several wonderful books. And so she gave me a writing prompt and a deadline, and I felt accountable to her. And so I started.
Oh,
And but it turned out that writing was the medium that I needed to process all of this really heavy ancestral baggage so that I could heal and come through all of that, and begin to move into a different way of being. But I think writing is not everybody's bag, and some people have other ways of processing stuff too, and they're all valid.
mhm. So behind the curtain of the writer's life, one of the things that nobody ever taught, they don't tell you, is good writing comes from your toenails all the way up through your nervous system, every emotion, every ache, everything that you can feel, you must feel fully
That's right.
before it's authentic on paper. This is the hardest work I've ever done.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, it is. It is.
Yeah.
I mean, there were so many days where I had writing days blocked out in my calendar, and I would just spend half the day just wailing and, and then beaming and then getting mad and going out in the woods and beating something with a stick and then coming back. You know,
Yeah.
it was just, yeah, the whole gamut.
Yeah. So, what do you think about the idea? I've always said memories are stored in your body, and when you start doing body work, or it's like returning to the scene of the crime, right?
Right.
Because all of that is stored in your body. And I read something that you do somatic work and somatic healing to release and that kind of thing. But what do you think is generational trauma also stored in that body? So there's generational trauma from 3 generations back that you have no conscious memory of, but your cells definitely do.
Yes, I think that that is true. There's a great book by a man named Mark Wolin called "It Didn't Start with You,"
Ah,
and he does family constellations
mhm,
therapy. And when I read that book, it resonated so much because he writes about the premise of, if there are things that happen in previous generations in your family that have never been worked through or resolved and maybe never discussed, were kept hidden away, were made secret, you don't even have to know about them, but they will still come up in future generations to be expressed so that they can be released and healed. And he gives a lot of fascinating examples in his book, but I really feel like that is a big part of what happened with me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a ninth generation settler on one side of my family, the side that I know the most about. And in a lot of ways, I think it was, you know, trauma, dispossession of land, shaming of language and identity in the Scottish Highlands that
Mm-hmm.
drove my people over here as refugees.
Mm-hmm.
And then they very quickly flipped around and became the oppressors over here.
Yep.
And so in a
Mm-hmm.
lot of ways, I think in that somehow now in the ninth generation, the time has come within our DNA that we all collectively share along this
Mm-hmm.
line. Our DNA is ready to turn back and look at what has happened to us. Our DNA is ready to hear our stories told and to have these things unpacked,
Mm-hmm.
and so that we can begin a new trajectory.
That is powerful. That is powerful. Hmm. I like you.
I like you too.
That's a lot. I felt that one. I felt that one
Hmm.
in my body. It's like, oh, that explains a lot about
Hmm.
how and why things are coming the way they are.
Right.
I did a blog in 2020, notes from a recovered Republican back in 2020. And I just reposted it on Substack 2 days ago because it came up again. And in that blog, I was talking about as a survivor of sexual abuse and domestic violence. And at that time, you know, you know, the candidate of choice was saying, we're going to keep the women safe. And flashed me right back to my abusive husband and when I had 3 children, and me saying to a therapist, cool, he'll give his life for us, but who's going to keep us safe from him?
Right.
And and what I was experiencing in that election cycle in 2020 and what shifted me a little to the left then, and I've continued, was that trauma that it brought up in my body, hearing and seeing and feeling that this is another abusive relationship. And I don't allow people like that in my life. How is this guy getting so much headspace?
Right. Yeah.
And I
Wonder
still
the same thing.
haven't figured out how to block that out. It's like a trauma bond
Hmm. It is.
situation.
Yeah. And it's also to me, it has the quality of some kind of like I don't know, black magic or
Mhm.
there's a spell. There's a
Yeah.
spell that has been cast
Hmm.
over a lot of us in this country. And why are we susceptible to this spell? I think about that all the time.
Hmm.
And in a lot of ways, I think it's because we've got this unexamined, traumatic, shared past,
Yeah.
that has just been put under the rug over many centuries of rugs have been laid over this past,
Yeah.
and it makes us susceptible to delusion.
Hmm. Right.
Hmm.
Yeah. And it's easier. If we are hardwired to seek pleasure and avoid pain, the work you and I are talking about, any of the work that leads you down the road to reparations is is painful.
Right.
It is
That's
hard
right.
work. Yeah.
Although I will say, the book My Grandmother's Hands by
Yeah.
Reza Nakim, he talks about clean pain versus
Mhm.
dirty pain.
Okay.
And this is the kind of pain that I'm talking about. It's clean pain.
Hmm.
You know, when you've got someone in your family who's, you know, getting drunk and incesting the children and stealing the college fund out of the bank account, to
Right.
look at that is you know is dirty pain. That's all dirty pain that's wanting to be covered up and obscured within the family.
Right.
But it becomes clean pain when somebody says no more. I'm going to lay all the cards out on the table and we're going to look at this.
Yeah.
And then it becomes this incredible force for healing,
Hmm.
becomes a catalyst.
Right. Well, and it didn't happen in a silo. It happened in community,
Mm-hmm.
public knowledge at the time. And the healing has to happen in community too, because the only thing that breaks shame is breaking silence,
That's right.
you know? So we have to do this in community. I can't see my blind spots. I've never been able to. I can see yours all day long. I'm no good at seeing my own. And
Exactly.
so as we mirror for each other,
Right.
I think that that's the important thing. What do you do to create a safe place for women to begin to mirror for each other?
Well, we have a couple of things. We have a really good set of community agreements that we work with that is based on some of the pitfalls that we've fallen in holes and made mistakes over the years of facilitating this work. So we've learned, to create a really strong container. And another way that we do it is that we always pray at the beginning of every session. We pray with a candle
Uh-huh.
and we sing a Gaelic kindling song
Mhm.
that was one of the songs of our ancestors.
Mhm.
And then my co-facilitator always prays with water, and we call in the ancestors that are benevolent and wise, the ones who are here to help us, and we ask for their help.
Mhm.
Another way that we do it is that we work with elders of
Mhm.
all different kinds of cultural backgrounds and spiritual backgrounds, but we work with really wise people who have lived through lots of stuff and know how to handle stuff.
Uh-huh. How did you find your co-facilitator? Tell me that story.
Well, we met in a spiritual community in New Mexico. It was probably about 10 years ago, and then she runs an organization called Organization of Nature Evolutionaries. They offer wonderful programming that's almost all of it is free.
Mhm.
And about 5 or 6 years ago, we decided to start collaborating together. And so she's a physician, she's a gardener, she knows a lot about plants and herbs and trees,
Mhm.
and I'm much more enmeshed in the social dynamics. And so we make a good complement for each other. And she's very wise. She's a very wise person, I think, from having spent so much time with, the land. And
Mhm. Mhm.
and so yeah, I'm really grateful. And now we have, people who have been part of our classes that are now going out and beginning to facilitate their own. So we're not gatekeeping or,
Uh-huh.
you don't have to be certified or anything like that. It's a relational trust that's
Yeah.
built that allows these things to spread.
Right. And
Yeah.
you're doing that on, those are online groups you two do
Mhm.
together?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And where do people find those groups if they want to learn more?
We are working on getting our website up for next year's circle, but people can sign up for the newsletter from Organization of Nature Evolutionaries, and they will be notified when registration opens.
Wonderful.
Yeah. And we only work with about 16 or 18 people every year because it's so time intensive to do this well,
Yes.
you know?
You.
Definitely not something you can scale.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
It is, what's that story about the starfish and the child throwing the starfish back into they're all beached and throwing them back in, and this older person, the parent comes along and says, "You're never going to make a difference. You can't save all these." And the kid picks it up and throws one back in and says, "Made a difference to that one."
Yeah, exactly.
That's kind of how I have operated in my avocation. My
Yeah,
life is, this is going to be one voice evolving. This is one life at a time, one baby step. If I work with you and you make one baby step in the time we work together, then that's a different place than where you started. And that's
absolutely.
all it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, that's a really decolonial way of working too.
Uh-huh.
All about relationship.
Yes.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. How did you begin to understand the decolonialization?
Well, it's funny. I was immersed in all of this and writing for years, and then I took a class with Bio Okomolafe, who is a Nigerian man. He's an author and brilliant human being, and he had a bunch of co-teachers in that class. And as I listened to that class and they were all talking about decolonization, and I realized, oh, that's what I'm doing. I didn't I didn't know that it had a name until that time. I was already knee deep in writing this book before I realized that that's actually what it was about. And
Mhm.
and probably that's because, the water I'd been swimming in my whole life was a colonial mindset, a
Right.
colonial culture,
Mhm.
and I
Mhm.
couldn't see it.
Right. Right. It was normal. It's all
Right.
you knew. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
I did a podcast with Christian Ortiz, and he is a code programmer, and he has taken Chat GPT, and his is called Justice AI, and put a decolonial information and filter into it, and it is freaking amazing. It is
Wow.
amazing. And so now I send my $20 a month to him instead of Chat GPT, and I can use Justice AI. And she is like my black BFF in a box who I can ask any question. I can just have conversation. I don't have to decode. I don't have to do anything. I can just speak to her and she gives me so much good stuff. But particularly with decolonialization, he has gone layers deep. So his name's Christian Ortiz. You can find him on LinkedIn. Highly recommend for anybody who's doing
Glad
this
to know
work.
about that.
And especially if you use any AI for anything, and most people do, and if you're not, you will be,
Yeah.
then the difference between if I put a question into Chat GPT, the whitewash version it gives me, versus the 7 layers that Justice AI gives me,
Wow. That's amazing.
it's a real learning tool.
Yeah. I'm so glad to know about that.
Yeah, can't help myself. Ah, so resilience reimagined. What the resilience that took us here, that brought us here, is not the resilience that's going to get us to the other side.
That's true.
So what is your vision for what resilience reimagined is going to look like in your world and what you're doing? I especially let's tie that into your comment about our DNA is ready now. Our
Right.
collective DNA is ready
Right.
to now really heal and deal with this.
Right. Yeah. I think when you look at the state that many of our ancestors were in when they came over here to Turtle Island,
Mhm.
many of them were just so desperate. They were starving. They had
Mhm.
been through decades or longer of war.
Right.
Many of them had been pushed off their land, or the land that was held in common for their livelihood and well-being, for their farming and their subsistence, had been taken with no warning. And all of a sudden, they're forced to move to cities where they're now urban poor, and their
Mhm.
entire livelihood has been stolen overnight. Some of them were starving. Like I think about my Irish ancestors who came after the potato famine.
Mhm.
They had experienced untold horrors. So a bunch of deeply traumatized people, not to mention the witch hunts as well. Okay. So then we've also got a, patriarchal reign of terror against women,
Mhm.
largely women.
Mhm.
So they come over here and they're traumatized. And the first thing they have to reach for is the same tools of oppression that were used against them,
Yep.
right? So
Yep.
now here we are, we're several generations out. Many of us have achieved a level of stability, and whether that's, with our income, our livelihood, our families, our place where we live. And so now we can begin to unpack and unwind that So when I look forward, I think we have got to find a way now to make choices that are not based on that kind of trauma.
Right.
And when you're making choices that are not based on trauma, when you're making choices that are based on a sense of wholeness as a
Mm-hmm.
human being,
Mm-hmm.
a sense of respect for all your fellow human beings, as well as respect for the water, respect for the land, respect for the mountain, respect for the fire, respect for the food, respect for the medicines, respect for the children. All of that, all of that respect has got to be built into how it is that we move forward. And we've got to make decisions that come out of a sense of mutuality.
Mm-hmm.
That if one of us has 20 times more than we need and one of us is starving, then we are not right with each other.
Right.
We have got to rebalance those scales so that all the children are fed, all the elders are taken care of,
Mm-hmm.
all the people who are giving birth to children have what they need, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's gotta, whatever paradigm is emerging, and I do think there's one emerging, although it's hard to see right now, but I hope and pray that it will be one of that nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which is, which is the feminine um, perception, perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, that has that. And I think that I think about my career path the first 40 years, and it was never let him see you sweat, never let him see you cry. Um, don't be over emotional, man up. It's a man's world, all of that. And when I stopped doing that and came into my own sovereign femininity and leading with heart, it it freed me in ways, and it freed it gave people permission to pivot.
I love that.
Yeah, that's
Could
what it was.
you share how it freed you? Anything, any example?
Oh my gosh, yes, because I was so, you talked about having a lid on you. It was,
Right,
living the script
right.
of. But when I started, I was in a leadership position. I'm used to being the only woman at the C-suite table, right?
Wow.
And all of the misogyny and all the stuff that you have to do. And it was when I started seeing my daughters, who are successful, accomplished women, dealing with the same crap when they were in their 20s that I dealt and I was like, I thought, I thought we conquered that. And it was still there and still rearing its head, and they were having to find new ways to do it. And that was when I stepped into, I started taking time away from work, and once a week and then once a month, I went and met with a sovereign group of other women executives to do our work. We did, the Ruiz, I think there was some work, the four agreements, and so we started working through some of that, the empowerment dynamic. And I started to acknowledge and appreciate the interwovenness of the feminine approach, that it
Mm,
wasn't it wasn't a less than approach. It was not valued in our cultural workplaces, but it was far more effective than what was happening. And so for me, it was the same thing as my master's degree. I didn't get my education until later in life, and I was 54, I think, 52 when I got my master's degree. And it wasn't until the second year of my master's degree that I was in a research class in the library at Gonzaga University, and it hit me that I belong here. I get it. I really belong here because my programming was there's no point in you going to college because you're just going to get married and make babies anyway, and it'll be wasted. So I'm not spending money on you. When my father died, I took my inheritance and went to college. That
ah,
was my FU. That was my full circle moment. I went and got
yeah,
my education. I already put a couple husbands and 3 kids through school. It was my turn, right?
right. Ah,
Um, So it changed. Education changed. It put a degree behind what I already knew how to do in the workplace, but it changed the way I moved in the world because
Mm,
it changed the way I saw myself. This work for racial equity has done the same thing.
mhm.
It changes, you can't unsee it, and it changes who you are. And more of who you are gets to be present. And that is a lot less damn work than
Yes,
masking up,
that's right.
acting up and showing up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you for giving voice to that. I love that.
We we all we all can do it, but we don't all um I think it is, I want to say oppression. Um it is the struggle that creates the strength.
That's
It is
right.
the struggle that creates the strength. And as long as I was trying to be still, be quiet, and don't make waves, which was my programming, instead of being a safe place, sharing spiritual insight in service to others, which is my God-given reason to be on the planet. But as long as I was playing small, then I didn't value my voice either,
Yeah.
you
Wow.
know. So the voice is important. Saying that stuff out loud, even if only to yourself, the wailing while you write,
Hmm.
critical part of the process.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right. That's right. Yep.
yeah. So I don't know how to, I don't know. I don't have a how to. I just have a, and this was my path. It's been my
Yeah.
experience.
Well,
Yeah.
and that I feel like that is the strength of storytelling,
Uh-huh.
right?
Yeah.
Because it humanizes us to each other. It builds empathy, builds
Mm-hmm.
curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
And we have not enough of that going around right now in our
Uh-huh.
country.
Right.
We need to build that
Mm-hmm.
much more curiosity, much more, willing to entertain other ideas and consider other options and put ourselves in someone else's shoes and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Very important.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a muscle. That's a different
Hmm.
muscle. So
Hmm.
how do you actually practice that? What does that look like in practice in your life?
Well, I've made a practice, for the last decade of putting myself into spaces where I'm the minority,
Yep.
and that has been the biggest teaching I could ever I could have ever received. Because, it's when you surround yourself with people who are very similar to you and have similar life stories, it's very easy to think that that's all there is. And I think by putting myself with other communities and other cultures, I've seen that, gosh, there's so much I don't know. There
Hmm.
is so much I don't know, and I'm never going to understand
Right.
many of the ways of being and the worldviews and the mental structures and the practices and the rituals, etc., that other communities have.
Hmm.
But I can appreciate them
Hmm.
and then try to listen for how I can be in reciprocity. That's another important part of this is like learning how to say, how, if at all, can I help?
Yes. And asking the question instead of assuming we know how.
Right.
What is it you need from me?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the answer has surprised me almost every time.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
My toolbox is so limited.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for our women, we're going to wrap this up pretty quick now. And I appreciate your time so much. But for our women over 40 who are inclined, first of all, I'd like them to know how to reach you and what you recommend for their first steps for reaching you. So let's start there. And then one or two resources or recommendations that you might have for them. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I do have an Instagram account and Facebook, and people can reach me there, or my website is goodrelative.com.
Okay.
And I have an events page on my website that I try to keep updated with what I'm doing and so forth. So that's one way. Um, and also, I would recommend, not to toot my own horn, but I would recommend if anyone feels resonance with our conversation today to check out my book. It's
Mhm.
called Becoming a Good Relative: Calling White Settlers Toward Truth, Healing, and Repair. And I am not receiving any income from book sales. All the income from book sales is going to the Decolonizing Wealth Project and
Thank you.
Jubilee Justice,
All right.
which are Black and Indigenous led organizations and doing very important work throughout the country. And
Beautiful.
so just by purchasing that book, you are beginning a journey into reparations.
That's
And
awesome.
that's why I did that, because that's the most important thing to me.
Mhm.
And then also, I want to share a resource that is called A Guide to Making a Personal Reparations Plan. It's a Google Doc. I have it out online for anybody who wants to see it. And it can just give you the initial steps to begin that process of making a personal, we can't fix it all. We
Mhm.
can't get too big for our britches, but we can take the first steps in a personal journey of reparations. And so I would like to share that as well. And I encourage people to get, you know, involved however it calls to them. The most
Mhm.
important thing with reparations, in my experience, is that it comes from your own heart, your own gifts, your own talent, your own passion. And so
Yes.
everyone can access that.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be a grand gesture. It can be buy a book. It can be a
Exactly.
baby step.
Yeah,
Nice that you've made that available that way. Is that Google Doc available on your website as well?
it is. Although
Okay.
I have a lot of resources on there, so it can be hard to find. So I'll send it to you directly.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
I'll put it up in the description.
yeah,
Be great.
yeah.
All right. Any parting thoughts?
Um, I guess I would say, for all the white women out there listening, there was a time when our people were something other than colonizers. There was a time when our people weren't even considered white.
Mhm.
And that phase of human history is much, much, much longer than the phase in which we have been engaging in colonialism and white supremacy. So we have thousands of years of genetic memory to draw on.
Mhm.
And we all carry that memory of who our people were before. And we can draw on that and to create the next world that's coming forward.
Thank you.